bonfire crackled against the October wind as Sarah threw another piece of driftwood into the flames. We'd been camping on Widow's Point for 3 days. Just the 4 of us. Sarah, her sister Emma, my girlfriend Lisa, and me. The isolated stretch of beach had been perfect for our getaway. Miles from the nearest town, and accessible only by a treacherous hiking trail through the coastal forest. The locals in the last village we'd passed through had given us strange looks when we mentioned our destination, but we'd laughed it off as small-town superstition. Now, as midnight approached and the tide began its retreat, I wished we'd listened to their warnings. The ocean seemed different tonight, darker somehow, with waves that moved in patterns that defied the wind's direction. Lisa sat beside me on our shared log, her hand finding mine as she stared into the hypnotic dance of flames. Emma was telling one of her ghost stories, her voice dramatic and theatrical as she gestured toward the black expanse of water behind us. They say something ancient lives in these waters, Emma continued, her eyes gleaming with mischief. Something that's been here since before the first ships arrived, before the native tribes even walked these shores. It only comes out during the new moon, when the darkness is complete, and the tide is low enough to reveal the old bones buried in the sand. Sarah rolled her eyes at her sister's dramatics, but I noticed how she unconsciously scooted closer to the fire, and how her gaze kept drifting toward the waterline. The first sign that something was wrong came as a sound I'll never forget, a low, keening wail that seemed to rise from the ocean itself. It wasn't the cry of any whale or seal I'd ever heard, but something far more ancient and infinitely hungrier. The fire flickered as if a cold wind had passed through our circle, though the air remained still. Lisa's grip on my hand tightened, her nails digging into my palm as we all turned toward the source of the sound. What emerged from the waves defied every law of nature I thought I understood. It was massive, easily 12 feet tall, with a body that seemed to shift between solid flesh and flowing water. Its skin glistened like wet kelp in the firelight, covered in barnacles and trailing seaweed that moved independently of any current. Where its face should have been, there was instead a writhing mass of tentacles, surrounding a mouth filled with teeth like broken shells. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Dozens of them, scattered across its torso, each one ancient and intelligent and utterly alien. The creature moved with impossible grace across the sand, leaving no footprints, despite its size. As it approached our campfire, I could smell the scent of deep ocean, of things long dead and forgotten in the crushing darkness of underwater trenches. Emma's ghost story died in her throat as we all scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to run. The forest behind us was too dense to navigate in the dark, and the creature stood between us and the only path back to civilization. "Don't move," I whispered, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The creature's many eyes fixed on our group, scanning each of us with predatory intelligence. When its gaze fell on me, I felt a moment of terror so pure it nearly stopped my heart. But then something strange happened. The creature's attention moved past me as if I were invisible, focusing instead on the 3 women huddled beside me. It spoke then, in a voice like the grinding of tectonic plates, words in a language that predated human civilization. But somehow, impossibly, I understood. It was old, older than recorded history, and it had made a bargain eons ago with forces even more ancient than itself. Immortality in exchange for tribute, for the life force of those it deemed worthy. And in its alien perception, only women possessed the spark it needed to sustain its endless existence. Lisa was the first to try to run. The creature moved with the fluid speed of a striking serpent, its tentacles wrapping around her waist before she'd taken 3 steps. Her scream cut through the night air as it lifted her effortlessly from the ground. I launched myself forward, grabbing desperately at her outstretched hands, but my fingers found only empty air. The creature regarded me with something that might have been amusement, then backhanded me casually across the beach. I hit the sand hard, tasting blood, my ribs screaming in protest. Sarah and Emma tried to run in opposite directions, but the creature's reach was impossibly long. Tentacles shot out like whips, coiling around their ankles and dragging them back through the sand. Their screams harmonised with Lisa's in a chorus of terror that I'll hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. I struggled to my feet, ready to fight this impossible thing with nothing but my bare hands. But the creature turned one massive eye toward me, and I felt it pressing against my mind like a physical weight. The mental contact was brief, but absolute. In that moment, I understood everything. The creature's true age, measured in geological epochs, its hunger, vast and patient as the tide itself, and most importantly, why it spared me. I was useless to it, my life force somehow lacking the quality it craved. Whether it was some fundamental difference between male and female energy, or something deeper and more mystical, I couldn't comprehend. All I knew was that I was beneath its notice, a witness rather than a participant in this ancient ritual. The creature began to retreat toward the ocean, carrying its 3 victims with an almost gentle care that made the scene even more horrific. Lisa's eyes found mine across the beach, wide with terror and confusion. I tried to run after them, screaming her name, but my legs felt like lead, and my vision blurred with tears and fury. The creature paused at the water's edge, turning back to regard me one final time. In that gaze, I saw a warning. Speak of this to no one, or face consequences far worse than death. The waves closed over them with barely a ripple, and suddenly I was alone on the beach with only the dying embers of our campfire for company. The silence was deafening after the screams, broken only by the normal sounds of wind and wave that seemed obscenely peaceful. I collapsed to my knees in the sand, staring at the spot where they'd vanished, half convinced that I'd imagined the entire nightmare. But the deep gouges in the sand where the creature had moved were real, and so were the scattered belongings of my companions. I spent the rest of that night huddled by the fire, jumping at every sound, expecting the creature to return for me, despite its dismissal. But dawn came without further incident, painting the ocean in deceptively beautiful shades of pink and gold. The beach looked normal in the daylight, almost idyllic, with no sign that anything unnatural had occurred. Even the gouges in the sand had been smoothed away by the returning tide, leaving me to wonder if I'd suffered some kind of psychotic break. The hike back to civilization took me 2 days, and by the time I reached the authorities, I'd crafted a more believable story. A rogue wave, I told them, had swept the 3 women out to sea while they walked along the shore. I'd tried to save them, but the current was too strong. The search teams found nothing, of course, though they spent weeks combing the coastline. The case was eventually closed as an accidental drowning, and I was left to carry the truth alone. That was 5 years ago, and I've never spoken of what really happened that night. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination brought on by trauma and grief, but the dreams won't let me forget. Every night I see those ancient eyes staring at me from the depths, and I hear Lisa calling my name across impossible distances. Sometimes I wake up with the taste of salt in my mouth and seaweed in my hair, though I live hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean now. The worst part isn't the guilt of surviving when they didn't, or even the knowledge that something so terrible exists in our world. The worst part is understanding why I was spared, branded with the knowledge that, in the creature's cosmic hierarchy, I was found wanting. I wasn't worthy of its attention, lacking whatever essential quality made the others valuable enough to steal. I survived not through courage or cleverness, but through cosmic insignificance, and that truth haunts me more than any monster ever could. The storm had been building all afternoon, turning the August sky the colour of old bruises as we made our way down to Crescent Bay. My sister Rachel had insisted on this trip to celebrate her engagement, bringing along her best friend Monica and her cousin Jessica for what she called one last girls' weekend before I become a boring married lady. I'd only come because Rachel had begged me to drive them, worried about taking her small car on the winding coastal roads. The weather forecast had called for possible thunderstorms, but nothing that would stop my stubborn sister once she'd set her mind on something. We'd rented a small beach house perched on the cliffs overlooking the bay, one of those quaint places that looked charming in the daylight, but felt isolated and vulnerable as darkness approached. The nearest neighbours were miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. I'd suggested we head back to town when the first lightning appeared on the horizon, but the women had already opened a bottle of wine and were determined to enjoy their evening despite the weather. They'd changed into their swimsuits and were planning a moonlight swim, laughing off my concerns about the approaching storm. By 10 o'clock, the rain had started in earnest, driving against the windows with increasing fury. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving us with only candles and the occasional flash of lightning to illuminate the house. Rachel found some battery-powered lanterns in a closet, and we gathered in the living room to wait out the storm. The women seemed to find the whole situation exciting, treating it like an adventure, but something about the intensity of the weather made me deeply uneasy. The first sign that this was more than an ordinary storm came when the rain suddenly stopped. Not gradually, the way storms usually fade, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence was absolute and unnatural, broken only by the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Through the windows, I could see that the clouds hadn't cleared. If anything, they seemed thicker and lower than before, pressing down on the house like a suffocating blanket. The air itself felt charged with more than just electricity, heavy with something ancient and expectant. That's when we heard the singing. It started low and wordless, drifting up from the beach below, like mist rising from warm water. At first I thought it might be the wind through the rocks, but the melody was too structured, too purposeful. The women heard it too, their conversation trailing off as they turned toward the windows. Monica moved to the glass first, pressing her face against the pane as she tried to peer through the darkness toward the water. The singing grew stronger, more complex, weaving harmonies that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something deeper in my brain. "Do you hear that?" Jessica whispered, her voice dreamy and distant. She was already moving toward the door, her eyes unfocused in the candlelight. Rachel and Monica followed, their movements synchronized in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to call out to them, to ask what they thought they were doing, but my voice seemed muffled and ineffective. The singing wrapped around us like invisible chains, and I realized with growing horror that it was calling to them specifically, drawing them toward the beach with supernatural compulsion. I forced myself to move, fighting against the strange lethargy that had settled over my limbs. The singing affected me too, but differently, like background music that I could acknowledge but not fully hear. I grabbed Rachel's arm as she reached for the door handle, and for a moment her eyes cleared, confusion replacing the vacant stare. But then the melody swelled again, and she shook me off with surprising strength, her face returning to that dreamy, sleepwalking expression. All three women filed out into the night, their bare feet silent on the wooden deck. I followed them down the narrow path that switched back to down the cliff face, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. The singing grew louder as we descended, and I could make out multiple voices now, a chorus that seemed to come from the water itself. Lightning flickered occasionally, illuminating the beach in brief, stark snapshots. The women walking steadily toward the waves, their white clothing ghostly in the intermittent light, and something massive moving just beneath the surface of the bay. The creature that rose from the depths was like nothing from any mythology I knew. Its body was serpentine but covered in what looked like overlapping scales made of mother of pearl. each one the size of a dinner plate. Where its head should have been, there was instead a crown of writhing appendages that glowed with their own phosphorescent light, creating the illusion of a living constellation against the storm clouds. The singing emanated from these tentacle-like projections, a sound that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. As the beast emerged fully from the water, I could see that it was ancient beyond measure. Barnacles and seaweed clung to its lower body, and parts of its hide bore scars that looked like they could only have been made by weapons from bygone eras. This was something that had existed when the oceans were young, something that had learned to hunt humans long before we'd developed the tools to fight back. The singing was its trap, a lure perfected over millennia to draw its preferred prey into the waves. The women waded into the surf without hesitation, the cold water that should have shocked them back to awareness seeming to have no effect. I screamed their names, my voice breaking with desperation, but they couldn't hear me over the creature's hypnotic melody. I splashed after them, grabbing at Rachel's hand, but she pulled away from me, as if I were the threat, not the monster that loomed above us in the darkness. The singing intensified, and I felt the edges of my vision begin to blur as the creature's influence pressed against my mind. But something was wrong. The creature's massive eyes, each one larger than my head, and filled with an intelligence that predated human civilization, fixed on me with what seemed like confusion. The singing faltered for just a moment, and in that brief silence, I heard Rachel gasp as if surfacing from deep water. The monster's attention turned back to the women, dismissing me entirely, and the melody resumed with a renewed intensity. I understood then that I was invisible to this thing, beneath its notice, possessing nothing it wanted or needed. The creature's appendages reached down like gentle fingers, caressing the faces of all three women with something that might have been affection. They stood motionless in the chest-deep water, their eyes reflecting the monster's phosphorescent glow, completely entranced by whatever visions it was sharing with them. I tried one last time to reach them, diving beneath the waves and swimming toward the group, but invisible barriers seemed to push me away. The creature's power was absolute over its chosen victims, and I was simply not chosen. What happened next will haunt me until the day I die. The creature began to sing a different song, one of completion and fulfillment, and the women responded by walking deeper into the water. They showed no fear, no struggle, as the waves closed over their heads. The monster followed them down, its glowing crown the last thing visible, before the bay returned to normal darkness. The storm resumed as suddenly as it had stopped, rain pelting the surface where they had vanished, erasing all trace of the supernatural encounter. I spent hours in that water, diving again and again, until exhaustion and hypothermia forced me back to shore. The rescue teams found nothing when they dragged the bay 3 days later, and the official report blamed the tragedy on the storm and dangerous swimming conditions. I was praised for my heroic attempts to save them, when the truth was that I had been powerless to do anything but watch. The creature had judged me and found me wanting, unworthy even of death. 5 years have passed and I still return to Crescent Bay every August, standing on that same beach and listening for the sound of singing beneath the waves. I tell myself I'm looking for closure, for some sign that they found peace in whatever realm the creature took them to. But deep down, I know I'm really hoping that someday it will find me worthy of its attention, that I'll finally hear that beautiful, terrible song meant for me alone. Because living with the knowledge that I wasn't even worth killing is a burden heavier than any guilt, and some nights I think oblivion might be preferable to this endless cosmic rejection.